So, what happens when a president is kidnapped? It's a wild question, right? Well, today we're diving deep into an eyewitness account straight from Caracas, Venezuela. We're going to unpack the anatomy of a crisis response, really, how a nation teetering on the brink managed to pull itself back.
And that right there is the central question in the source material we're looking at. I mean, think about it. When a nation's leader just vanishes, you'd expect chaos, right? A total power vacuum, things falling apart. But in Venezuela, according to this account, well, that's just not what happened. What makes this so interesting is where the information comes from. This isn't some report from a distant newsroom. No, our source gives us an eyewitness account right from the streets of Caracas as the whole thing went down.
All right, so let's jump right in. Let's go to those first few critical hours of the crisis in Caracas, exactly as our source on the ground described them.
Okay, so things moved incredibly fast. The whole thing kicks off at 2 a.m. with about 45 minutes of bombing in Caracas. Right away, the government gets on the air and says the country's been attacked. And then, the bombshell news drops. President Nicolás Maduro has been kidnapped. So what was the immediate reaction from the people? Well, according to our source, they didn't panic and run. They started gathering, spontaneously, at Miraflores, the presidential palace.
Now, this wasn't just some random response. The source argues that the people were actually following a playbook, a plan they learned back in 2002 during the anti-coup efforts against Hugo Chavez. It's almost like a practiced reflex. If the leader is threatened, you go defend the palace.
Okay, so that's how the people responded. But what about the state itself? How did the government apparatus react to this sudden, massive leadership vacuum?
So, with Maduro gone, the Constitution kicked in and Delcy Rodriguez took over as acting president. The source really highlights how fast and decisive she was. She immediately demanded Maduro's return, she publicly and forcefully shot down any idea of collaboration with the U.S., and this was a really key move, she appeared with all the top ministers to show everyone a united front. And her core message? It was this incredibly powerful statement of national sovereignty that really echoed through the entire response. She said, "This is a colony of no country." That one line basically became the rallying cry, and it framed the whole crisis as a fight against imperialism. But the messaging here wasn't just verbal, it was visual too. By standing there with the ministers of defense, foreign affairs, and the interior, Rodriguez was showing the world, and her own people, that the chain of command was completely intact. This was a really strategic move, designed to project stability and stop any widespread panic before it could even start. But the state's response, as important as it was really only one part of the equation. Now we have to turn to this idea of a people in arms, which is how the source describes this unique civilian military defense strategy. So at the very heart of this strategy is something called the Civic Military Police Union. Our source explains this as a national defense doctrine, something developed by Chavez and then Maduro, that actually integrates armed civilians right alongside the state's official security forces. And what that suggests is that the response we saw wasn't just a spontaneous uprising, it was more like a planned deployment. And this doctrine, it was put into practice, and fast. The eyewitness reports seeing arms being handed out to civilians in the barrios. These newly armed civilians then started occupying the streets to keep order, and this was all happening alongside massive pro-government marches. What's really telling is that the source specifically mentioned seeing armed women taking part, which just highlights how broad this mobilization really was. And all of this leads to what is really the central argument from our source, which the eyewitness sums up perfectly. If you have the people in arms, the people are empowered. The logic they're presenting is pretty straightforward. A government that is willing to trust its own citizens with weapons must, by definition, have their democratic support. Okay, so the big question is, why? Why did all of this happen the way it did? Well, this next part helps put it all in context. We're going to look at what the source calls a broader narrative of resistance, the anti-imperialist playbook. First things first, the source builds its case by directly taking on the accusations from the U.S. government against Maduro. All those claims, drug trafficking, mass killings, corruption, they're dismissed as absurd and false. They're framed as nothing more than excuses, pretexts for intervention. And to really drive this point home, the source draws this really sharp contrast with the 2019 crisis in Bolivia. Think about it. In Venezuela, the institutions held firm and government communications stayed on the air. But in Bolivia, the state collapsed, state TV stations were ransacked, and a full regime change was achieved. So for the source, this comparison is basically proof that Venezuela's response model actually worked.
And once again, the source circles right back to history. The argument is that Maduro was deliberately following that revolutionary playbook that Hugo Chavez established way back during his own kidnapping in 2002. So this wasn't improvisation, not at all. It was a practiced, well-rehearsed response.
So what exactly is this playbook? Well, according to the source, it's pretty simple. Just 3 steps. Step 1, the leader gets taken, removed by hostile forces. Step 2, that leader finds a way, any way, to signal defiance, to let people know they have not resigned. And step 3, that signal becomes the spark that rallies the state and the people to fight back. And the account claims Maduro played this out perfectly, even using a simple hand gesture to show everyone he was still in the fight.
And all of this brings us to the source's final, powerful assessment. Venezuela has not fallen. Now, to really understand this outcome, we have to look at the alleged motive behind the whole thing. The source argues that the goal here wasn't a big military invasion. It was something way more subtle, to trigger an internal collapse. The thinking was, if you kidnap the president, it'll create enough chaos and protest to achieve regime change from the inside out. But that collapse, it just never happened. And this quote from the source really captures that final feeling. It's a mix of victory, but also a recognition that the struggle isn't over. They have not taken Venezuela. Venezuela has not fallen. The fight to prevent that is going on right now. So what's the ultimate takeaway from this entire account? It really boils down to this. The source argues that it was the unified response from the state, the military, and a mobilized, armed populace all working together that was the single critical factor that prevented the collapse that its opponents wanted to see. And that leaves us with one last, big question that stems directly from the source's argument. If an armed, organized populace really is the ultimate defense of a state, what does that model suggest about the true nature of power?